when we believe we love someone, our go-to isn't this person's toxic. It's how can I make this work? And how can I make this work means we take the responsibility on themselves. And when we see pieces of evidence that don't line up with this is a nice person, we're going to do everything we can do to either justify, rationalize, or find another explanation. Since time immemorial, history is made by narcissistic people. Innovations are made by narcissistic people. Some of the biggest creative endeavors were undertaken by narcissistic people. In some ways, that grandiose boldness is what makes an idea turn into something that revolutionizes the world. All this cruelty we see social media and internet-wise, a lot of that is sort of gobbled up by the variance induced by vulnerable narcissism. Feel bad for him. I mean, in a way, he's sort of like the really unlikable kid who had a swimming pool, and so people would be his friend in the summer. It's that.
So I read the book, and I'm not sure what it is, but man, as a society, we are just obsessed with narcissists, myself included. And I think maybe it's because we've all dealt with one in business or a romantic relationship or a marriage or a friendship. And in the examples of the people in your book, all of the above somehow at the same time for some of those poor folks. But is it just that narcissists are unavoidable? Because they certainly seem to be everywhere.
They are. Here's the thing. I think that it's they are unavoidable simply by dint of the fact that they're often very good at what they do. So if you're somebody who wants to meet a partner who it feels like to you, at least on paper, they have it all together, or you're in industries where you're networking with lots of people, right? There's a certain inevitability in that unless you really know what you're looking for. And then it becomes this interesting tension between people saying, okay, this person may not be, I don't know, I'm not, I don't know, ultra ambitious, or they may not be like have a big fancy job, but my goodness, they're the kindest human being I've ever met. Sadly, people still don't date that way. They don't. I mean, some people end up in those relationships and blessed are they because they really have healthy relationships. But I think the way that we're kind of sort of pointed towards people and told these are the people you should know, you should talk to, that are cool, that have hip cred, whatever, that whole thing, I think actually sometimes stacks the deck towards that. And then you throw in the family piece. And it's sort of like, that's a roll of the dice. A lot of people have it. Not everyone does. But when it comes to adult life, unless you're super discerning, I think it's certainly inevitable. You will run into a narcissist.
That's a really good point. That's a great point because you're right. We're wired for status. So if I'm out there dating and I'm like, I'm a science teacher. I'm not going to flex on Instagram. And then I'm dating. I'm like, oh, dating is hard. But if I'm an influencer who's constantly bragging about, I don't know, spending the night in a hut in Bali and doing videos, it might be really easy for me to date. But then if my entire life is showing off to other people, I'm not saying all those people are narcissists, but I'm going to go ahead and guess the Venn diagram of influencer who shows off their lifestyle influencer and narcissist. Yeah. I'm guessing that there's a decent Venn diagram there. Maybe not a complete circle, but something like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I loved what you just said. It was so beautifully put. You said wired for status. And we are. I mean, in the sense that, and it's not sort of a modern superficial thing. I think we've always been wired for this sense of looking towards, sort of people who are the leaders, people who are doing the thing. And so they become whoever. Back in the day, they might have been the sort of the mayor of the town or the person who ran the church or something like that. But we are wired for that. And we're also wired to view those people as desirable. And so I think that is why, because we almost feel fortunate when we're in the presence of these sort of status level people. And probabilistically, people of higher status are going to be narcissistic because status matters. Usually status has to matter for a person to pursue it, if that makes sense. I mean, every so often you'll find the person who was born into an incredibly wealthy family and they're just a decent human being and their status comes from their proximity to that family, but they themselves are nice. But, that's not a common occurrence.
Right. You look at Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, right, who donates all this money and seems like a very sort of normal person.
Yeah.
And you go, wow. How did that happen? Oh, right. She wasn't rich her entire life and doesn't seem to care for the whole thing. Seems like a normal person. And then she married a science teacher, actually, to pull it full circle, I suppose.
Full circle. But that's what it is, though, is I think that we're not, I mean, obviously, many people, I was a university professor, like it's another sort of more kind of geeked out, kind of chill space at times. But I think that You're absolutely right. I mean, as someone who's a lifestyle influencer, if someone's asking me to take a bet, like I'm buying a raffle ticket, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to buy this as that this is probably someone who's got narcissistic qualities, because the drive to want to do that, when the drive is to be admired,
Mhm.
right? And it's how the occupation is defined, you're going to be much better at that job if you're narcissistic. That's a fact.
When I was reading this book, I could not help but think about a lot of the people I know that are. I'm thinking, man, you work so much. Why don't you get married and have kids? Why do you need another YouTube channel and another podcast and another whatever? And then you start to sort of put the pieces together, and you're like, oh, your whole life is. Who am I taking a selfie with today? And it's just kind of like, oh no. And you feel bad for them. But also, I know some of these people's current or ex partners, and I'm like, oh, you have real deep seated insecurity, which is one of the sort of pillars of narcissism or narcissists in the book. The other thing I liked about this book is it's a new angle, because a lot of books about narcissists are about the actual person who is the narcissist, whereas this book is about the victims or the people that have to deal with them all the time. And that seems like a new angle as far as, at least from the stuff that I've read so far on narcissism.
Well, I mean, I think that narcissistic people are fascinating in the sense that I think the reason that people don't watch documentaries and Netflix shows about nice people,
No.
they watch them about serial
I was going to say
killers.
serial killers. Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
So that's what we're drawn to. We want to understand the mind of somebody who is able to hurt us. Like, what we want to understand the why behind that, because that's not a normative behavior. And so I think the why of narcissism piece, it's the same thing in the academic literature, Jordan. And when you look at the academic literature, I could count on one hand the number of published papers there are on people who have been harmed by narcissistic people, but I can tell you there's hundreds, if not thousands, about the narcissistic people themselves. And so that bias is, I think, partly our sort of our fascination with sort of people who don't do nice things and trying to understand them. Maybe we think we could outwit them. Maybe we think we can protect ourselves. But I think it's really created a real hole. But I think we had to have that conversation first. We had to even identify it, put it out there as a phenomenon, say this is a thing. And as more and more people absorb this is a thing, and this might even be a thing that's happening in my life, then we could really open up full throttle this conversation on healing.
Yeah, you say it really well in the book. You say, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, until the lion can talk, the story of the hunt will always be in the voice of the hunter. Because we're talking about narcissists, we're fascinated by them, they're charming, they get away with everything. But nobody's really talking about the wife of the narcissist whose life has been ruined, who didn't go get cancer treatment because he kept minimizing her symptoms, and now she's stage 4 or whatever. And those are the people that matter, right? The narcissist is not a good person, right? In many of these scenarios.
They're not, but here's where it gets really tricky, right? I mean, we have to be realists, is that sadly in our world, and even in time, since time immemorial, history is made by narcissistic people. Innovations are made by narcissistic people. Some of the biggest creative endeavors were undertaken by narcissistic people. In some ways, that grandiose boldness is what makes an idea turn into something that revolutionizes the world. But we turn them, but then sadly, what we do is we deify them, right? We turn them into our gods. If we could just say, you know, thanks for the tech and please don't come into my house kind of thing, we would be in much better shape. So I think that we've always sort of glorified this. We don't glorify the person, sort of the person who was standing alongside
Right.
or was a support for the person who made these things happen. And I am not convinced we ever will.
No, it doesn't
I'm
make sense.
pinning my hopes in realistic places. And so, but I want the people who've gone through these things to feel seen and heard and recognize that what happened to them is real. Because up till now, I have to tell you, the mental health profession has all but abandoned these people.
Yeah.
And I'm done.
It does seem that way. I mean, I don't have any personal experience with that, but it does, just by your book, it does largely seem that way. And you're right. Going back to we're wired for status, we're never going to be like, I wonder who the person behind the Edison was. It's like, well, no, we want to talk about him. But also for every Thomas Edison, and I'm not sure if he was a narcissist, who knows? I'm sure we could find out if we read all of his journals or something. But for every guy like that, who's a super innovator and maybe also a narcissist, there's a million nobodies who are also narcissists that do something, that work with all of us day to day, and we're thinking, why do you think you're so special? You're doing the same thing as me, and we both hate our jobs. What are you talking about? You're not special. And so, yeah. But these, if they're listening right now, they don't think we're talking about them anyway. So I guess I should save my breath.
No. Nope, they don't think we're talking about them. And I think what's really tricky about narcissism is that most narcissistic people, at least at the superficial level, the level we interact with them at, they think that they're good people. They think of themselves, I'm super empathic. I'm a great person. I help so many people. I'm so nice. I'm so generous. That's their self concept. It has to be. Because the whole idea is they're putting out what they believe is a sort of a perfect idealized self. And at a very deep, unprocessed, churning, internal volcanic level, they know that's not true. That's where that insecurity comes from. That's where those bits of rage we see is when those two things kind of come. Those things get activated. That inner insecurity gets activated, but they're not in touch with it. It's not like someone can say, "Ooh, you're hitting a real tender place for me. I need a second." That's what a healthy person does. That is not what happens with someone narcissistic. And so, and interestingly, Edison, actually, there are historical records suggesting that he wasn't a very nice guy.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, I don't know if
mhm.
it's just hard to say, right? Without and you know this as a practitioner, it's probably really hard to go. That person has this disorder based on things I've read about them, right? Don't you have to sort of like have them talk to you?
You
Yeah,
do. You do. I mean, you absolutely do. And I think this is one of the issues is that even for me, I have to say, like, the reason a narcissistic person would get into therapy might be, for example, they're feeling some anxiety about a job. They're feeling sad because of a relationship broke up. They're feeling upset because there's a failure to launch. Something's getting them in the door, or they feel as though sometimes it's for optics, but at the end of the day, they're coming in sometimes for something else, addiction even. So as a therapist, we tend to focus on the most acute issue, the depression, the anxiety, the addiction. That makes sense, right? That's the issue that's causing the most trouble for them. It might even be a safety issue. So we address that. And then we address that. And then we address that. We're like, how am I not making any
right.
progress? Most of us will even think, like, maybe I'm not a very good therapist. But if narcissism is under those other issues, you're really going to feel like you're making very little progress. You might even lift some of the depression-y stuff, but you're not going to get to that core sense of, why is everyone out to get me?
That goes along with what you said in the book. Trying to fix a relationship like this, you say relationship, but a relationship with a narcissistic partner. Trying to fix a relationship like this without getting at the root cause, narcissistic behavior, is like trying to fix an engine problem by putting air in the tires. So if you're treating the addiction, but the person is still not being treated for narcissism or narcissistic behavior, yeah, you're putting air in the tires, even though you have sugar in the gas tank or whatever. It's also tricky with therapy because it seems like a lot of times people who are in relationships with narcissists, they're getting blamed, of course, for the problems in the relationship by the narcissist, but then they go to therapy and it's like, are you sure you're trying hard enough? It seems like or if they're with their partner, it seems like he's willing to engage. And you're like, I've been with him for 20 years. He always says this. We come here and then everyone says, but you're in therapy and you're still having this problem. Maybe it's you.
Hmm.
Because it's like part of the game or something.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, therapy is based on an assumption that's not always like I say when I'm teaching therapists, it's not always what we call antagonism informed.
Okay.
It doesn't account for the asymmetry that's brought into a relationship by antagonism, by narcissism. Antagonism is an umbrella word. Narcissism lives underneath it. And so as a result, especially people who work in couples work, relationship work, family work, it's all observed in the sense of everyone is contributing. And I have a real problem thinking that somebody who's stuck in a relationship they can't figure out how to get out of or how to get out of safely is contributing to a problem. They didn't know. And a lot of folks will say, my goodness, now that I have the roadmap,
Yeah.
like I'm out of here. This is ridiculous. I wish I had known this. I wish they taught me in school. I wish someone had sat and taught me this because I would have known to look for these things because some of these patterns, when they happened early in the relationship, they were uncomfortable, but I was taught to forgive, give second chances, make allowances for people. Those strategies were great in healthy relationships. They're a disaster when you do them with someone who's narcissistic.
Right. So almost like any sensible way of living in a relationship with somebody else is maladaptive if you're in a narcissistic or a
Mhm.
relationship with a narcissistic person. So if you're, and I wonder if is it worse in certain cultures? Because like I'm going to go ahead and say that if I'm a jerk to my wife, she's going to be like, what the hell is your problem? And kind of like show me what's the euphemism here? She's going to show me what's what, right? I'm not going to get away with it. But there are other cultures where you don't talk back to your husband that your parents picked out for you or whatever. Like that does not happen. And you want to leave? Nope, that's not happening. I did an episode on honor killing and I'm kind of thinking of like these really traditional cultures.
So honor killing, things like honor killing, constructs like honor, authoritarianism, patriarchy, those are going to be cultures, honestly, where narcissism flourishes, and the built-in asymmetry of relationships in certain cultures. The more asymmetry that's society lends to the relationship, the more likely that the narcissistic abuse will be worse. I don't think it's gonna. I mean, I don't think it's gonna make someone who's not
Right.
narcissistic, but someone who is. There's absolutely no. There's no path forward for a person in that kind of a situation. And those kinds of cultural tendrils, even if you person migrates away from that culture, those still might be assumptions that are held about relationships. So people will say, if I speak out about my relationship, I could end up blowing up my relationship with my family of origin or with my community. So none of these are easy decisions. And because this narcissism conversation is evolving, right? That a lot of people say, well, is that even a thing? And what are you talking about? And do they have a disorder? And all this other stuff. It confuses it. And throw in there too, I mean, narcissism's not considered a nice thing to
Hmm.
be. You know, some people walk around and say, yeah, well, of course I got the goods and that's why I'm like this or whatever. But by and large, it's not a word people like to use or believe it's a nice sort of a term. So when a person thinks that way about a family member, about a partner, they almost feel like they're being disloyal. Like, oh, maybe I'm the problem if I'm willing to see someone I'm supposed to
Hmm.
love in this way.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's kind of there's a lot stacked against you if you're trying to get out of a relationship with somebody like this. In that, it can be exacerbated by the conservative culture that you may have grown up in or your family, and you paint a really tough picture in the book where it's like, if you want to leave, okay, how do you do it? But then what happens when you have kids with this person? You have to co-parent. Or what happens when it's your sister? Oh, you're ruining the family. You don't want to come to Christmas dinner? Well,
Hmm.
yeah, because
Hmm.
Shelly makes me feel like absolute crap every time, and
Hmm.
nobody checks her behavior because we've
Right.
been dancing around it for her entire life,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
she gets to dictate Christmas. And now I got to bring my kids and husband in, and we're all gonna get treated like crap. And then you're gonna blame me for it? Like, no, thank you. And so it's got to be really hard to get away from somebody like this because you're related to them a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the challenge is exactly that, is that a person might have the moment of, and this is to your point from from the top of what we're talking about. What is narcissism? Why are we so fascinated by it? And while knowing it, interesting, yeah, sure, great. This is interesting. Yep, this is definitely my sister. Now you have this knowledge, but everyone else in your family may not have it. And so even though you've been sort of your eyes have been, open to it, it is kept in place because of the other people in the system who don't want to call it
Right.
out, but also have sort of implicitly been enabling it all these years. Everyone will say, yeah, 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 we have to be a little careful around Shelley, but come on, isn't that just all families?
No.
No, it's not. And if it is all families, then it's not okay in all families. I mean, I think that we can say that. I think the ultimate sort of, if we were to boil it down to one simple thing, this behavior is not okay. It's that simple. And I think that the challenge, though, is our need for social belongingness, our need for social connection is so strong that we'll make a million modifications so we can maintain those connections. So many people will say, all right, we'll just suck it up every
Mhm.
year at Christmas because we value potentially the sense of belonging to this larger system.
Yeah, gosh. And do narcissists know this stuff consciously, or are they just really good at manipulating the system to work in their favor? Because I have to believe that Shelley, who's not a real person, knows that she's ruining Christmas, right? And just or
Mm,
doesn't. Do they really think they're the victim, or are they just kind? I guess maybe they do.
I mean, listen, there's knowing and there's knowing, Jordan, right? So there's the unprocessed, unconscious stuff that we have that's not even, again, it's not even accessible to us in conscious awareness. And then there's the stuff that we believe, right? And the stuff we believe drives how we go through the world. And sure, Shelley at some unconscious level may know that, like, well, this is the only way I can get attention. If I don't get attention, everyone's going to abandon me. Shelley is not in touch with that. And so the fact of the matter is, Shelley actually believes everyone else is the problem. Everyone else is out to get her. Everyone else wants to blame her for Christmas being bad. Why has everyone always been so mean to her? And that truly, Shelley believes that. And the problem with all the unconscious stuff in narcissism, that's my problem. As a therapist, like if I'm going to get in there and open the hood and sort of monkeying around in the engine of someone's mind, sure, we're going to get to that unconscious stuff, we hope, at some point. But for all the human beings that have to deal with the narcissistic person, we can't keep making excuses around their unconscious world. We've got to deal with them, and we have to deal with the Shelley who actually genuinely thinks of herself as a victim.
That makes me feel a little bit bad for these people because I can't imagine living that way. I mean, don't get me wrong. I feel much more for the victim who has to deal with this person, especially if they're married to them or related to them. But gosh, can you imagine living that way? Everyone's out to get me. Nothing works out in my favor. The only way to get attention is to blow everything up. If I don't get attention, everyone's going to leave me. That's awful. They're in a prison of their own mind in a way, I guess.
Ish, but they're also spoiled children. Because one thing you got to remember about the Shelleys is it's quite possible that someone like a Shelley in this story has a work life where she actually shows up as a decent person. A person like Shelley might actually keep it together if on one given year a higher status guest shows up to Christmas that regularly doesn't come. So I think that the capacity of narcissistic people, not only to keep it together, but be quite charming, charismatic, well put together in front of certain audiences, but behind closed doors when they're with a partner or family and go off on them. Those sort of dual repertoires can really make people say, well, this is obviously they're aware of it. They've been screaming at work too. So there is awareness, Jordan. And yes, I don't disagree with you. I don't envy them either. And I wouldn't want to be them either. But guess what? Everyone else is doing the vulnerable work of therapy to deal with them. They can sign up for it too. Yeah,
you're right. If they can control their behavior, then they can control their freaking behavior, right? If you can not ruin Christmas because the rich so-and-so showed up, that rich uncle whatever who might put you in his will is there, then you cannot ruin Christmas when your sister's there with her kids and doesn't have anything that she's going to leave you with. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. If you can control your behavior, then, okay, well, you have some agency here. Why the hell aren't you using it to be a decent person instead of a horrible bully? Yeah. One thing that I thought was particularly striking is kind of one of your mini theses in the book, which is the narcissistic behavior was there before you entered the picture or the relationship, and it's going to be there after you're gone. And the patterns, they don't change. So those around them, which is like you, if you're listening to this and you're not the narcissist, you're not responsible for them or for the changes, which, by the way, probably won't happen anyway, which I thought that was really important for people to remember.
Personality is stable. I mean, it grows and it evolves until we're probably in our mid to late 20s, and then it's pretty stable. You've known people for a long time, Jordan. You think of people you've known for 30 years. They've consistently kind of been who they are. It might be a few tweaks here and there, but I've had one friend since 13. She was agreeable at 13, and she's agreeable at 58, and nothing has changed. And so I think that you've got to remember, we all have personalities and they're all relatively stable. So yes, it's been there all along, but that key piece is, I think that when we keep having this conversation, they can't change, their behavior can't change, whatever, is I think you even want to put a finer point on it here, is that you are not going to be the reason it changes. So I think a lot of people almost take it as a challenge, like, oh, come on, I'm not quitting someone I love. I'm not quitting someone I care about. I said, this isn't about quitting. This is about doing something impossible. I'm also not about to slingshot to Mars right now. I'd love to. I'm curious, but I'm not going to do it because it's not possible. It's cold. And so, yeah, it's cold. It's probably dusty. But the fact of the matter is that I think that people have to understand that even if you say, well, come on, everyone can change, only if they take responsibility for it and they consistently commit to it every day of their lives. That's what's probably not going to happen. So if you're going to turn this into some sort of parlor trick of like, oh, come on now, show me that this can never happen. It's not about the never of it all. It's that you're not going to be the reason it changes. And Jordan, I'm sure there's people listening. You may have had this experience. I certainly have had this experience where there were narcissistic people in my life that I don't interact with, and I still hear about them here and there. Nothing's changed. And I've had nothing to do with them for over a decade, and nothing has changed.
There's people in my life where I suspect that they have something like this, and other friends, mutual friends will go, all right, so how long until so-and-so blows up his marriage? And I'm like, oh, who knows? Maybe and then sure enough, 5 years later, it's like, oh, they got divorced? Well, I can't say I'm too surprised. Oh, they're back together. They're divorced again. It's like, okay. Or, oh, that business, he cheated those business partners too. Well, I guess, some things never change. And it really, you just kind of have to wait for the other shoe to drop with these people a lot of the time.
Absolutely. And I think that piece of it is listen, empathic, decent human beings don't want to walk around the world assuming the worst of everyone. It's not a nice way to go through life, especially if we know someone, and certainly if we care about them. But the key to understanding narcissism is like, listen, we're not going to get rid of all the narcissists in our lives. And most of us don't even wish ill will on them. We just want them to leave us the hell alone. And so then when you look at your narcissistic friend who's getting married, you're like, oh my gosh, they're going to blow this up in 5 years. And they blow it up in 5 years. And that's, it's coming. Like we also, there's a sort of a radical acceptance of, we sort of know, we've seen the end of this movie. We know how this one goes. And so that's radical acceptance, is we know this. And it doesn't necessarily mean we end all these relationships. Friendships are interesting, right? They can hurt us, but they often don't have the impact as like an intimate partner would, or a parent or a family member we see regularly, not in the same way.
How do we separate narcissists from people who are merely self-absorbed or shallow or arrogant? Where's the sort of line on bad behavior that turns somebody into something diagnosable or treatable?
Right. So self-absorption and arrogance, while they're part of the narcissistic picture, are by themselves not narcissism. And I use this analogy all the time. If someone showed up at my front door with an egg, I'd be like, thanks for the egg. I would not say thanks for the cake. They'd need to mix that with flour, sugar, baking soda, and all the other goodies and stick it in the oven. And then I'd say thanks for the cake. But the egg is part of the cake. And so when we get into sort of the strands of narcissism, if you will, the self-absorption, the arrogance, even the entitlement to a degree, if those things are freestanding, I mean, it's pretty rare to find an entitled person who's empathic, but it can happen. Sometimes you'll see it in very, very privileged, wealthy, feet don't touch the ground kind of people. Like they're just so used to things running exactly on their schedule that there can be an entitlement, but you talk to them a bit more and there's a decent human being under there. They've just been sort of, again, they've been coddled to such a ridiculous degree. But by and large, the things you got to remember is where there's self-absorption and arrogance, there's also likely to be low empathy, entitlement, a need for admiration. These things tend to hang out together. But if for some reason you've pulled one strand, and let's not even use self-absorption because that's generally is associated with narcissism, but let's just call it selfishness.
Okay.
A person who really says, you know what, my time is my own. I love my work, whatever. I'm a writer. I have to write 12 hours a day. I need my environment to be a certain way. And as a result, I've made some decisions. I'm not going to get into an intimate relationship because I'm probably, going to drive someone out of their mind with all my demands. And so, that's not a choice I'm going to make. I kind of like my life the way it is. They've made this known. They're not drawing someone into the swamp, right? Or not even a swamp. It's like, I like to write. I like to do my thing. I like to travel on my own. I like to live my life in my own way. I don't think that's selfishness. If a person, it is selfishness. If you want, it is selfishness. If a person says, I'm only living a life that works for me, but I don't think it's narcissism. If it's not accompanied with all that other stuff, a person's like, this is how I like things. And I love having dinner with friends. Some people will have members of their family. I know someone who's a sibling like this, and they've said they are the best aunt you would ever know in your life. They are kind. They're generous. They take my kid on vacations, but when they're doing their thing, they're doing their thing. And that's that. And so there's a clarity, and they've communicated that, and they're not cruel to anyone. So that would be the strand of selfishness got pulled out without all the other sort of bells and whistles that make it narcissism. So we have to be careful if we meet someone. Let's say you meet someone and they're very authoritative about what they know in a conversation, and they're very da 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 da, and they almost seem imperious, right? It's easy to say after that meeting, that person's narcissistic. But then you run into them in a bathroom and they're super warm and nice, and you're like, what the hell? And then you talk to them a little further at the group dinner and you're like, well, this is actually a really kind person. You recognize the way they show up in that particular setting It's very specific. And yet the rest of them, they're very warm. That cuts across other situations. That can happen. It's not the norm though, Jordan. I mean, these things hang together.
I feel like you just described me, which is why I'm laughing, because my wife will go, you just kind of like you talked a lot during that phase and da-da-da. And then I'll see the person and their wife later. And I'm like, so tell me more about, you said you go to Aspen all the time or you snowboard. And then I remember one guy's wife was like, I'm surprised because I didn't think I was going to like you after the first time we met.
Interesting.
And I was like, she's like, no offense though, because you're like, what? And I'm like, I'm not offended. I get that all the time. And it's on me because I don't I don't know, whatever that was at the time, let other people talk or whatever it was. This is years ago, but I just remember that interaction. And that's why I'm chuckling, because I definitely have done that exact thing and had that exact experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And but so the episodes though, Jordan, I think it's like, we have to personality isn't about episodes, it's about a through line, right? So if the imperious person remained imperious in that interaction, and I'll tell you where it gets interesting. And let me tell you the sort of interesting kind of corner of this. There are people who will come across in front of an audience as the warmest, loveliest, healiest people in the world, but then you have a conversation on the side and they're monstrous. I had this happen once with someone who's considered one of the most beloved people, and I had a conversation. It was one of the most offensive experiences I had ever had. Then I made a few sort of discreet inquiries, and they're like, oh no, he's an absolutely terrible human being. And so there it tracks. This is somebody who's able to do that communal, narcissistic, performative, I'm the savior of the world, but is actually a terrible person. It takes us to an interesting corner of narcissism. I just use the term communal narcissism. Communal narcissistic people are people who get their supply, their validation, and their admiration by being perceived as sort of being these do-gooders, save the world, aren't I wonderful? That's their source of it. And they actually get quite churlish and angry if they're not getting validated and being viewed as the savior of the world for doing all of that. But like I said, their audiences identify with them as saviors. And then I've even watched them dealing with audiences. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. They're so contemptuous. So that is not an uncommon maneuver in those spaces. I mean, it's lovely when you meet the person who tracks. They're lovely in the sort of their space, and then you meet them in the side and they're lovely people. When that happens, you're like, bless the world that these kinds of people actually get ahead.
I hear that. There's that phrase, never meet your heroes. And I will never say, I'll never say I'm a lovely person, but the biggest compliment I get is when people go, you're like the same person you are on the podcast in real life. I'm like, thank you. Yes, I only faking things is hard. I'm a terrible actor, but at least they're not going, wow, I thought you would be like nicer or something. Yeah, that would make me, that would hurt my feelings. You mentioned narcissistic supply. Let's talk about what this is, because first of all, I'd never heard of this, but man, does it add clarity to how these people, how and why these people are the way they are. They kind of, it's like, it's almost like they're oxygen. They need this or they just shrivel up and die, or at least that's how they behave.
Mm-hmm. It's exactly what it is. It is oxygen. Narcissistic supply. I always have the visual of this massive warehouse and trucks all going into it full and coming out empty. And that's sort of what everyone around the narcissistic person feels like, a truck full of stuff that always leaves that warehouse of the narcissistic person empty. And so it's admiration, it's praise, it's validation, it's status, it's fame, it's money. It's all those things are considered supply. It's not just someone telling them they're great. Supply can also be being famous. And so, because now everyone, again, thinks they're the hero and you're the healer or whatever it is. So it can be any of those things can be the supply. And so the narcissistic person will work steadfastly to ensure that the supply stream is steady. A person who has a lot of money can buy people around them, right? If you ever watched a rich person's household, there's always people going in and out. There's a hair person and a fixer person and a cleaning person and a yoga person and a get your energy clean person. Like, they're always surrounded by people, but the people are all on the payroll. And so there's this sense of community around them, but I'm like, oh, wow, all these people are being paid to be here. And so for that person, for a wealthy narcissistic person, getting supply is actually very, very easy. Mm-hmm. But for other, like a less resourced narcissistic person, which is most of them, it's a lot trickier. Social media changed the game, Jordan. Social media changed the game. I'll always remember that day. I think I might have even said this in our last episode back in 2000, I think it was 8 or so, 7, 8. Somebody said, hey, Ram, you need to look at this thing called Facebook. You'll find it curious. And I remember looking at it. I was already doing this work of studying narcissism, and my stomach dropped. I thought, oh my gosh, these fools are going to be able to get validation without leaving the house. Because back in the day, they actually did need to leave the house. Like they'd have to go to work or go into the world or their community in some way. They'd have to go out and get it. There was no way to share your life with everybody. These would certainly be the people in their friendship group who would yammer on about, let me tell you about my vacation to Hawaii. And you'd have, back in the day, we'd call them, we'd have to watch your slides from the vacation. And so it's that, like it would, so they would bore a small group of people.
Right.
But then one day the world changed in a period of a year or two. And so what it did was social media gave, especially the grandiose narcissistic people, in essence, a playground to get validation 24/7. And I think they've always been grandiose narcissistic folks, but they were really able to harness this platform to get the thing that they needed psychologically at a mass scale.
Does getting more supply make you worse in terms of your behavior? Because otherwise, social media would be it would be good, right? Because it's like, hey, now you can post your stupid vacation photos of Italy to Facebook and we can ignore them there. We don't have to come over for what you're pretending is your wife's birthday party, but is really a chance for you to show off your new car and your slides. Or is it like, oh, now that you can get likes, you're just even more insufferable because the supply comes more easily?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the problems becomes is that it should, because when a narcissistic person has quote unquote enough supply, they're regulated. They're better regulated. So on a day, for example, a narcissistic person, let's say they get a promotion or they get a big bonus. They're the fun dad that day. They're the great partner. They're good friend. Like, hey, they'll call, hey, how you doing? And they'll be like that person, right? Because it was their great day. But every day you can't get a promotion. Every day you can't get a big raise. So what social media did was initially, I think it was really exciting, but then it's never enough, right? Well, that picture only got 200 likes. I wanted to get 2,000 likes. I only have 100,000 followers. I want 1 million followers. So it created this new carrot to chase. And it also did something that really messed with the world in an interesting way. It allowed the narcissistic people to peer behind the curtain into other people's lives and recognize that some people have lives that might be cooler than theirs. And that made them go off. They went absolutely, this is what made narcissism go bonkers. And the vulnerable narcissist, the subtype of narcissism where these are people who often don't overtly at all look grandiose and preening and arrogant, but rather these are folks who look victimized, sullen, resentful, angry. Why didn't I get my turn? Why does he have more? I never got my chance, and he only got there because of da 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 da. And it's this very, they're very aggrieved. There's a failure to launch. For these vulnerable folks, seeing what other people have, if you will, has made them completely lose their minds. And I think a lot of all the internet trolls, that tends to be vulnerable narcissism. So all this cruelty we see on the all this cruelty we see social media and internet wise, a lot of that is sort of gobbled up by the variants induced by vulnerable narcissism.
That's insightful. Because I always, whenever I see these really cruel trolls, I always wonder, what are you like in real life? What is your deal? Julia Roberts just posted something, and it was quite interesting. It was a video. There's a photo of her with her niece, and her niece had just slept over, and they were playing cards or something, and she took a photo. And it's cute. It's Julia Roberts and her cute niece holding cards and smiling, whatever. And she said, but the comments on the photo were so horrible. She's not aging well. And she gave some examples, and I was like, who's sitting here trashing Julia Roberts sitting with her niece? I mean, it's a cute photo. Like, move on with your life.
Right.
And she said she's 51, and she just couldn't believe it because it hurts. And she's like, I'm an internationally, she didn't say it this way, but she's an internationally famous superstar. And she's like, and it still hurt my feelings. Yeah. And she goes, but what if I was 15 years old? And that was her point. Like, it's just trashing people's self-esteem. But to your point, who's sitting there being
Them.
like, I'm going to say the meanest thing I can to this
The
person?
vulnerable narcissist. And it's dangerous, Jordan. It's not just like they're just saying mean things to people. It is sometimes creating an anger, a volcanic anger in folks who feel like, how come it's not me? How come I'm not getting my turn? I'm so mad. I'm so mad. So I'm going to not only put other people down, I'm sometimes going to really lash out at them in dangerous ways. So in fact, there's a narcissism expert, Dr. Keith Campbell, is a professor at University of Georgia, who I absolutely adore him. And he's such a brilliant man. But him and I are in both agreement. Grandiose narcissism, they've always been around. The people who brag and want to show you their vacation photos and think they're so great and they're annoying and they cheat on their wives, sure, whatever. I mean, they've always been there. But this particular brand of narcissism has also always kind of been there too, but they've gotten this new fuel from seeing that, like, it's like they're going to bring other people down. Typically, the vulnerable narcissist could only bring down the people who are in proximity to them. Now they can do it everywhere. And the harm of it, like you said, 51-year-old woman is still gorgeous, successful. 51-year-old woman was hurt by it. Can you imagine in someone younger or someone more vulnerable? Even they have to be 15. They could be at any age, but vulnerable for some reason. It's very upsetting. And this whole idea of it's free speech, no, it's not free speech.
No,
it's cruel. And so that cruelty, though, very much we can explain a lot of the variance there. It's vulnerable narcissism, this victimized soul, and how come it's not my turn? I'm entitled to having a better life than this. How come you have a better life than me? Grandiose narcissists don't get that kind of sour about it. They're like, I'm going to figure out how to get your life, and then I'm going to get it, and I'm going to get it better than yours. And they actually probably might, because grandiose narcissistic people have a lot of what we call agency. They go out and they get things done. That's why they're interesting. They're interesting to have on a team because they actually behave like a-holes, but they do get things done.
Yeah. So that's why they haven't been bred out of the population, right? Because they
hell no.
occasionally have these great successes. They're just so motivated. That's what I was saying before about the influencers. Like, you meet these people and they don't want to have kids and they don't want to have close friends because they're just going to trade them in for cooler friends next year anyways.
That's right.
And they don't say it like that, but I've got a former buddy who he literally told a bunch of our mutual friends, hey, I can't hang out with you anymore because I really only hang out with like famous superstars now and you're just not there. And I was like, how are you saying this and not thinking I'm a piece of crap for thinking like that? How are you actually? I almost had to admire the chutzpah to even think it, let alone tell the person, hey, I'm not hanging out with you because you're not famous. It's insane.
And it is that's what we call it, delusional grandiosity, right? It's not quite delusional because if it was delusional, then it'd be psychotic, but it is an almost delusional grandiosity. Like they really, really kind of believe their hype. And a lot of narcissistic people across all types of narcissism don't really have a filter. So they'll sort of say what they want to say because they don't have empathy, right? We have filters in part because, first of all, because we have a frontal lobe, but second of all, because we have empathy. And so we might say like, ooh, I want to say that, but I'm not because I could really hurt this person. And so I'm going to hold back on saying it for that reason. They don't have that need to do that. And if also it's posturing, like, look, I hang out with famous people and you don't. Ultimately, it's always a play for supply.
Yeah, that's kind of one reason why you have that 1% where I feel bad for him, but then the other 99% is, but he's such an a-hole.
Yeah, I don't really feel bad for him. I mean, in a way, he's sort of like the really unlikable kid who had a swimming pool, and so people would be his friend in the summer. It's that.
That's a great example. That's so funny. Thanks for watching on YouTube. Remember, you can also enjoy The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our podcast feed is a treasure trove of insights from intellectuals, authors, spies, artists, athletes, pioneers, engineers, former mafia bosses, and business leaders, all sharing their secrets to success. For more information, click the link in the description. Now, back to the show. You mentioned consistency in the book. When they have adequate narcissistic supply, they're on top of the world, but then they're perpetually bored and they often seek excitement or novelty. And I'm guessing this is what leads to some of the overspending that these people do, and certainly a lot of the cheating in relationships, which the previous aforementioned example, he can't stop cheating on people that he's with because he'll trade in a girlfriend he'll trade in the nice girlfriend for the one that has more followers on Instagram, literally. And it's like, it's a choice no sane person would make.
But it's not a sanity, right? I mean, I think there's a there is the value system is different. I guess that's the way. And the motivation system is different. And I think in understanding when you're in a relationship with someone narcissistic, listen, the healthiest people amongst us are very clear on what motivates them to do what they do. Right? The more clear we are in our motivations, the more we're in line with our authentic selves, right? Like, a person might even be able to say, like, yeah, the part of the reason I want that is ego, and owning that, it's healthy.
Mhm.
It's healthy to know that, because then when it doesn't work out, you're clear on why it stings, but it's not like a secret. The more secret things are, the more they sort of fester and come out in terrible ways. To tell you a narcissistic person has almost 0% awareness of why they do the things they do. So and this is a mistake people always make in an argument with a narcissist, why would you have done that? For example, why would you have cheated on me? I've been such a good da 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 da. And the narcissistic person will actually probably, because now shame has been brought up for them, they'll blame the other person, they'll defend themselves. It wasn't that big a deal. Let it go, la la la. But they'll never answer that question because they can't.
Mm-hmm. Because they're just not, like you said, not connected to that part at all. They're completely unaware.
No, there's no self-reflective capacity, right? The health, the work of being a person is to say, what is this about for me? So going back to what led me to say that is the motivations for healthy people are, listen, motivations could be things like achievement and affiliation and even power, right? We are social species. Human beings are social creatures, wanting to be with other people, care about other people. It's built into our DNA. We needed it for survival when we were small. We're not turtles that came out of an egg on a beach and go swim off and figure it out. We are human beings that take a long time to develop and need our caregivers. Attachment matters to this species. And so when people don't care about it, that does definitely speak that they've definitely stepped off the norm. And I think that challenge is that you're playing by a different rule book when you're in this relationship. You may value closeness and love and connection, but they value power and domination and control and validation. You're just, one of you is playing chess and one of you is playing checkers. They're both great games, but they don't make sense to be played simultaneously. And someone's going to get frustrated real fast.
Right. Yeah. You can't play them on the same board and expect a good outcome. What's scary is with the grandiosity, especially, you don't know which version to expect, right? If your partner is narcissistic and you're home and you're, I don't know, watching Netflix and making dinner or something, you don't know who's coming home. Is it the person who had a great day at work because their boss was like, great presentation there, Simpson? Or is it the person who their colleague that they don't like because they're constantly comparing themselves to them? That person got a compliment by the boss, so their entire life is now ruined for the next 48 hours. Who's walking in the door? That's the part that would give me just anxiety all day.
Well, that's why people in these relationships are always anxious, because there is no consistency. There is no communication about it. And because again, sort of admitting I didn't get the promotion because I wasn't as good as the other guy that brings up too much shame. Whereas someone else will say, I didn't get the promotion. I feel absolutely terrible and I need a minute. But I also have to know that he had better sales totals than me. Like, there's a healthy human being ultimately will get there. But that inconsistency and that unpredictability, which actually isn't unpredictability, it's really the narcissistic person's moods really literally are in lockstep with what happened with them that day. They lack that consistency, that through line. Even a person's like, okay, I had a bad day. They might even call the partner and say, listen, I'm going to take a longer drive, or I'm going to go to the gym on the way home because I need to let some of this out. I don't want to take it out on you. So there's enough of that self-awareness to know I had a terrible day. I don't want to take it out on others, or I better go to bed early or whatever. They don't do that. Everyone's sort of, they can throw their tantrums everywhere. So really, in some ways, the narcissistic person sort of stuck at the developmental level of a 3 or a 4-year-old. I can tantrum anywhere, and that people are going to forgive me because I'm 3 or 4. So they do believe that people always have to show them grace, but they won't show grace to others. And that unpredictability, who's coming home, who am I going to get, what's going to set them off, means that anybody in one of these relationships does feel chronically anxious and chronically walks on eggshells.
Yeah, I just couldn't imagine living like that. Another thing that I thought was quite insightful, you mentioned the narcissists are chronically insecure, but it's not about high or low self-esteem, which I kind of tie those together, right? If you have low self-esteem, you're insecure, but it's not really about that. It's this lurking sense of inadequacy that's that's close to the bone, I think you said. And what's scary about this one is I'm like, wait, I think I have that too. I mean, but that in a vacuum doesn't make somebody a narcissist, right? It just makes them, I don't know, a little bit insecure, I suppose.
I always say that, especially when we talk about gaslighting is the pathologically insecure preying on the conventionally insecure. Most of us are what I call conventionally insecure, right? I mean, it is to be a healthy human being is to be aware of your strengths and weaknesses. And none of us have had a perfect run of it. So we will admit like, oh, that's a little bit of tender tissue for me. And I'm going to just be careful with that. And so we know what our insecurities are and we slowly process them. And it takes a minute. It takes some miles on our tires to get there. Narcissistic people have what we'd call distorted self-esteem because they either think of themselves as the greatest, most perfect person in the world, or they fall into a big blob of shame. There's no middle ground. There's no middle ground like, yeah, I know some of this, but I don't know all of it. Like, I'm not perfect at this. That idea that for the narcissistic person to either be ordinary or imperfect, it really feels intolerable because all of this perfection and this grandiosity and this greatness is it's like a suit of armor around all this insecurity. In fact, the analogy I've been using more and more is that you have to think of the insecurity and the shame inside a narcissist as like a volcano that's always bubbling in them. And on top of that volcano is like a big, heavy metal manhole cover. And that manhole cover is all their defenses, their grandiosity and arrogance and all the rest of it. But every so often, that manhole cover gets kicked off a little. Maybe they don't get the promotion. Maybe somebody makes fun of them. Maybe they don't get enough likes, whatever it is, they get snudged, right? Well, then some of that lava and that explosive gook comes out, and that comes out in the form of rage. And they're either going to rage at someone overtly, like be overtly aggressive or verbally angry, or they're going to be passive aggressive, or they're going to withdraw, or they're going to withhold. But either way, they're going to have a strong emotional reaction to some of that schmutzy shame coming out of them. And they want to get that manhole cover in place. And how do you get it in place? By being the dominant one. And you do that through your anger.
Right. So you put other people underneath you or whatever. So so they're fragile, but
Very
they're
fragile.
they're also ashamed of being fragile from
Correct.
the sound of it. Oh, man.
That's right.
Do I have that one too? I don't know. Maybe I don't want to admit that. I don't know. I feel like sometimes I'm insecure and fragile, but I think you're right. It's an egg, not a cake, I think.
Right. And you're not lashing out at someone. So when we're having our fragile moments, we all have them. This is not saying that, well, the rest of us are not walking around with fragility. We're all walking around with it. It's what we do with it, and understand it as simply being part of being a human being.
I cry alone in the shower like everybody else.
Love it.
Narcissists clearly can't relate to others emotionally well if they're like this, right? What do they do? If you are ashamed of your own vulnerability or your own fragility, I would imagine that somebody else wanting to share that with you, like their own stuff, or that would be probably triggering, right? If their romantic partner's like, I feel this way, it's like, I don't want anything to do with that.
Right. So other people's emotion, in fact, the term emotion allergy has been used to describe narcissists, but it's actually more of a disgust or a contempt. It's as though when you open up those emotions, because it's bringing up in some level, it's pinging that manhole cover again, right? That it's usually met with like, ugh, God, really? You're so sensitive. And then there's often a pathologization of that other person. You're so sensitive. You're so needy. You're so this. So what they've done is they've projected their shame onto that other person. So now the other person's the one with the problem. You're the person that's all these messy emotions. Who needs it, right? And now the other person's left holding the bag that not only do they have an emotion, they're being told that they're dirty and bad. So that's how the narcissistic people do it. They fling it off. They're like made of Teflon. And they're always flinging off onto others. So the others around them often feel quite destabilized, but the narcissistic person kind of gets to stay pristine on the pedestal.
Yeah, the projection thing rings true. A couple of the people I know that are having a lot of these, whenever I read one of your books, I'm like, oh, it's just still talking about this person, like dead on for them. A lot of projection and projection plus gaslighting, right? So it'd be like, you always do this. And it's like, what do I? I don't have any awareness of that. Well, that's because you're not self-aware enough to do that. And then it's like, but last week you did this thing, or last month you did this thing. And I'm thinking, no, you're the one. You're the one that you said that and did that. I didn't do that. And then you start thinking, am I just misremembering this? And then you have to ask other people if you even can, if they were there. And in one example, I lived with a person and his girlfriend, and she would, of course, back him up. But I think 15 years later now, they've been broken up for a long time. She wrote me an email and I was like, hey, I'm surprised to hear from you. Yet she's like, well, I never actually really thought you were a bad guy, but I was dating this other person. So what was I supposed to do? And I was like, oh, okay. That pretty much shows me all I need to know. Cause I was thinking either I've come such a long way in the last 15 years, and I'm sure that I have in many ways, or a lot of that was bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just
Mm-hmm.
being blasted with it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. Projection is projection is what we call a primitive defense. It's a very, very, it's a way that people sort of, again, like think of it as like an infant or something like that. This is not my problem. It's not my ick. It's your ick, right? And so then the person gets to, again, they get to stay pristine with inside. So as soon as there's any kind of unconsciously unacceptable impulse or feeling, it gets knocked off into someone else, right? And that becomes, in fact, I always say an interesting tell on whether the narcissist is cheating on you is if you're not and they keep accusing you of cheating on them. I'm like, I have a feeling that their house isn't that clean. So it's whatever they're accusing you of is usually something that they're doing or struggling with. And so that's something to also pay attention to as well. But if you don't know what projection is while it's happening, you're like, what the hell? Like, and then that it becomes part of also the larger framework of gaslighting, where you're being accused of things that aren't true, being told there's something wrong with you, that you're not remembering things correctly. And like I said, because of empathy, initially we believe them.
Sure. Yeah. Nobody wants to be a bad roommate and a bad friend.
Nope.
Especially when, and then there's two of them and you're like, well, yeah, maybe I am ruining their relationship. What was interesting is finally, my mom and other people were like, I'm pretty sure that this is what's going on, and like laying it out more clearly for me. And I'd gone to see a therapist, and she was very much like, you need to move out. And I was like, I don't know if I can, whatever. I move out. 2 months later, they broke up because they couldn't blame me for their problems anymore, right? I was gone. And so the cannons had to move to her, and she was like, oh.
Correct. That's exactly right. That they need. And so in some ways, there often can be a third party to absorb the blows, right? And then the person in the relationship who may be invested in making the relationship work. And this is how people get stuck, Jordan, is that when we believe we love someone, our go-to isn't this person's toxic. It's how can I make this work? And how can I make this work means we take the responsibility on themselves. And when we see pieces of evidence that don't line up with this is a nice person, we're going to do everything we can do to either justify, rationalize, or find another explanation. So for a while, you were the justification. Oh, it's Jordan, it's Jordan, it's Jordan. Pull you out of the picture. And that's an interesting way when there is a third party, pull you out. And now it's mass destruction on the other person. The narcissistic person doesn't stop. They just find a new target.
Yeah. It was quite interesting to hear from this woman after 15 years and have her be like, sounds like we both had a bad breakup with so-and-so. And I was laughing because I was like, that's exactly kind of what it was, right? It was, I finally just left. And my therapist was like, look, she basically fired me as a client a month later because she's like, all the things that you were having problems with are just kind of gone now. And I was like, yeah, that was really interesting and something I should have seen clearly. And she's like, don't blame yourself, right? But it was quite interesting to see, because usually I would imagine as a therapist, you don't just rip off one Band-Aid and then everything is fine. There's usually a lot more going on. But I guess if you live with somebody like that and they're throwing all this stuff on you and you're not actually the problem, then when you leave, it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm not depressed anymore because I'm not being like abused essentially by somebody anymore. And I live on my own, and then you start making different friends and dating because you're not living with your two quote unquote best friends who actually hate you, right? So like things change pretty rapidly. So anyone who's in this situation, much easier said than done, but like getting out is probably a really good idea.
Oh, listen, the thing that I always approach this part of the conversation very tentatively, because a lot of people can't get out and they think, well, what then? Am I going to be in forever sort of in hell? No, you're not. So it's this. In an ideal world, I'm going to be honest with you, the gold standard, the best way it could go is you do not have to have contact with this person anymore. It's never, ever going to feel good. And anyone who's had that experience where they were able to get out of a narcissistic relationship after the initial shock, and if it wasn't too bad in the post-separation period, they'll say, yeah, no, my life is much richer with this person out of it, right? For those who have to stay in these relationships for whatever long reason, and no one has to defend the reason they're staying, but they have to stay. Healing is very possible. It's something I really break down in the book. It really is. A lot of this has to do, though, with that moment, that radical acceptance moment, that penny drop moment when you realize I'm never, ever going to get what I need here. It's the day you realize I keep just dropping a bucket in this well and I keep getting no water. And you're like, yep, this is not ever going to give me water. And that you start building up a world outside of it. It could be friends. It could be taking a class. It could be a social group. It could be a healthy spiritual community. It could be an exercise class. It could be anything, but it's a place and existing friendships that you put more time into, that you realize that this is not the place to go. And there's a lot of grief around that because you're like, great, I'm in this marriage. It's just never going to be healthy. And I had to go outside of it. However, then I tell people, let's bring you back to the why of staying. You might be staying for kids. You might be staying for financial reasons. That doesn't always feel good because a lot of people will say, listen, someone dropped a bag of money on me. This would take care of a lot of my problems. It mean I could move out because in expensive areas, it's actually hard to go and start a new household, especially if there's not a lot of money in play and a person doesn't have steady employment. So there's a lot of things that might be at play here, but you definitely can still heal because once you hear it, see it clearly what it is, you'll be a little less likely to personalize it. You'll say, okay, this is not a me thing. That's why I called it. It's not you. This is a them thing. And this is how they treat everyone. And my bad luck was this was the person I am with. And where can I find the meaning and the purpose? Where can I find the fulfillments in my life? Where can I find the awe and joy? And always remember to never share it with them because they're just going to make fun of it.
Right. And in the book, which we'll link in the show notes, and by the way, people, if you use the links to buy the books, it helps support the show. In the book, you have a lot of practicals that are like, here's what you can do to get validation or have fun doing things this way, and don't bother sharing it with a narcissistic person because they're not going to ever allow you to enjoy it. They're going to try to make it worse for you. There's a lot of practical sort of drills and exercises in the book, which I really appreciate because it's real easy for us to be like, get away from a narcissist. And everyone's like, cool, I'm a single mom with 3 kids under 5. No. Thanks for the advice, you jerks.
Exactly. And that's it's the thanks for the advice, you jerks, I wanted to get away from because I've seen this happen, even for cultural reasons, because my hope is that this book gets into in the hands of people around the world, is that in some parts of the world to say that it's ridiculous. Like it's not even meaningful guidance and it's disrespectful. It doesn't account for the context. And also we elevate that to people who it's their parents, especially if they're aging parents, and people will say, okay, these people are old. I'm not walking away at this point. I don't need to spend as much time with them. But now they understand the limitations of these relationships and may actually ensure just that their older parents are, not in danger or something like that, and say because ultimately you got to ask yourself what you can live with, right?
Yeah.
Because people say, I feel like a sucker. Here I am taking care of this person and they've been nothing but terrible to me. I'll say you're not doing it for them. You're doing it because it's congruent with who you are. And that, and some people say, I'm actually a very caring person and I'm still not going to care for them. I'll say that's absolutely fine. It's always giving yourself permission to make the decision that feels right to you, because that's what healing is that you actually allow yourself to be you, for your real self to finally be expressed because it was shut down in the narcissistic relationship.
Yeah, I've got a friend who will take care of her aging parents, but she's like, I'm not letting you see the kids. And they're like, why are you abusing us by not letting us see our grandkids? And she's like, no, I'm not letting you abuse them, but I'm still going to pay for your caretaker. I'm still going to come over and deliver groceries, but no, I'm not going to let you tell my 12-year-old daughter that she's fat every time you see her because it hurts her feelings.
That's right, and unfortunately they won't stop, right? Or they'll find the way in, like, oh gosh, how are you? Don't worry, I won't say that you're fat. Your mom already told me I'm not supposed to say that. So you're saying it's never gonna end. Like it's a game, right? It's all tactic. And there's a tremendous oppositionality to narcissistic people. You got to remember that. It's like, you're not going to tell me what to do. And they're very big on that. My freedom. You're not going to tell me what to do. And so they get really kind of riled up. So you can never ask them to do something directly. I mean, it's the sort of thing where you just don't do the dishes. And at some point they're going to need a cup and they'll wash it because they need the cup. Like asking them to wash the cup, though, will get you nowhere. And so that's one thing that people have to remember is they're thinking, why is it that even when I directly communicate to them that they're not getting it? It's because they're naturally oppositional.
you mentioned in the book that narcissism isn't a disorder. So what is it then? Because, and also, isn't there narcissistic personality disorder? So is that different? Because
Yeah.
it sounds like a
So
disorder.
narcissism's a personality style, right? It's a maladaptive personality style. It's an antagonistic personality style. It's not probably one of the good ones, but it is one, okay? Just like agreeableness is a personality style, and extroversion is a personality style, and neuroticism is a personality style. They're all personality styles, right? And so when a person has a narcissistic personality style and they show up to a therapist's office or some licensed mental health practitioner, that person spends time with them and may evaluate them and say, this seems to all add up to NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and they put it in their record. That's when a person has narcissistic personality disorder. And that doesn't happen that much. In fact, most of the research that's done here, it's usually done on sort of like groups of people who are already coming into a clinic and we don't get their names. Like I've done a lot of this kind of research with hundreds or thousands of patients. And they come in and we interview them with a very set checklist, but they're not often coming in for clinical care. And they're also not coming in because they're coming in for help. They're coming in to be in a research study, right? In those studies, we see narcissism, we see NPD, narcissistic personality disorder prevalence rate somewhere between 1% and 6%, right? That's usually what the research has found. Now, there are people out there in the world, Jordan, who have a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And frankly, their narcissistic patterns may not be as severe as someone who doesn't have the diagnosis. It's just that the person who doesn't have the diagnosis never went to go see someone. And since the vast majority of narcissistic people don't end up in a clinician's office, most of them aren't diagnosed. So I personally think they should get rid of the diagnosis. I don't think it's helping anyone, but that's the difference.
You also said that in the book, the more maladaptive a personality, the less likely they are to change. Why is that? You would think somebody who's more maladaptive would have more consequences and therefore might actually try harder to fix something, but that's maybe not what happens.
Mental flexibility is sort of a key to health. Just like physical flexibility is a key to health, mental flexibility is a key to health. It's why people are resilient. It's why people are able to solve problems. There's a sort of a go with the flow, being able to pivot, being able to adapt to new situations, all flexibility. Antagonistic personality styles like narcissism are very inflexible. So they're almost like people whose muscles are absolutely stiff as can be. It's not good for your health, right? It's also not good for your mental health. And so, and accompanying these maladaptive styles are things like an incapacity for intimacy, a closeness with another person, a real incapacity for empathy, a lack of awareness of why they do what they do, that lack of self-direction. There is a lack of clarity on how they set goals. This is what we see across all maladaptive styles. And so it's looked different depending on the personality style. So it's not an adaptive style. It is not a resilient style. It is not a style that's good relating to other people. And those things are key to being a healthy human being. So that's why it's called maladaptive.
Yeah, that does make quite a bit of sense. And of course, some of these characteristics that come with narcissistic abuse or narcissistic behavior are interesting. You mentioned gaslighting before. I'm not sure everybody knows what that is. Maybe we should have defined it 20 minutes ago, but can we do it now?
Yeah, so gaslighting is sort of a tactic, for lack of a better way to call it. And I think it qualifies as emotional abuse. And gaslighting involves a relationship that's predicated on some level of trust. Okay, one person's the gaslighter, one person's the gaslightee. The gaslighter will doubt the reality, perceptions, experience, memory of the other person in the relationship. And then they will also imply that there's something wrong with the other person. Like, I never said that. What's wrong with you? But because this relationship is based on trust, it could be a partner, it could be a family member, it could even be like a medical professional or someone who has an expertise. You believe them. Right? You believe it's plausible what they're saying, right? Because none of us are going to remember every single thing. And so you'll say, okay, yeah, no, yeah, sure. And now you're sort of destabilized because they're kind of going after you having something wrong with you at this point. So now you're in a different argument. But this doesn't happen just once. Gaslighting, certainly in a narcissistic relationship, happens all the time. So over time, people who are gaslighted second guess themselves. They doubt themselves. they blame themselves. They can almost become obsessive in how they do things, like, okay, I need to make sure this is 100% correct. Okay, did we document everything? Because I don't want them to come back around and say, so you waste a lot of time. I mean, over and over again, like they'll say, did you remember that this and this on a trip? And you will have put it aside, but then they chose not to put it in the bag. And so you'll feel literally like you're losing your mind. This can involve things like even in manipulating the environment just to mess with you. So that they might move a checkbook, and you're sort of religious about putting it in the same place every time. You go to the place, it's not there. You're like, what the actual? And they'll turn around and say, well, I guess you're not as organized as you thought you were. So they will do something to undercut that sense of self. It is abuse. It is abuse. And it is a part of every narcissistic relationship. Gaslighting, though, Jordan, it's not just lying. And it's also not a difference of opinion. So you'll see two people in a conversation and they'll say, I think that this team is great. And the other person will say, I think that team is absolutely terrible. And they'll say, don't gaslight me. That might, they're not gaslighting you. They just have a different opinion than you. That's not gaslighting.
Okay. Yeah, this is literally denying their reality and possibly engineering things so that you look right. The moving the checkbook thing, that's sort of next level, right? Because it's not you're not just lying to make up for something that you forgot. Like, oh, you didn't bring the passports. You said you put them in your bag, and you're like, oh crap, I did, but I don't want to be wrong. So I can see somebody gaslighting if they really can't be wrong because it like fractures their worldview of them as perfect or whatever it is. But then to engineer a situation in which somebody else is wrong, that is really pathological and creepy.
Yeah, but if they're trying to bolster their argument that because it might very well be that as part of your gaslighting, like gaslighting healing, healing's the wrong word, like your gaslighting response, you organize everything to within an inch of its life. And they know that. And you're like, no, this house is practically alphabetized. Well, they're not going to let you have that position. So they're going to do something to destabilize that position. It would be to move something.
In the D.A.R.V.O model, you see this all the time on the internet. I think this is fascinating. Is there a brief way to take us through this? Because I think a lot of people might go, oh my God, this is happening to me.
Yeah. So D.A.R.V.O, let's give props to Dr. Jennifer Fried, who developed this model. And D.A.R.V.O stands for deny, attack, reverse victim offender. It happens in every narcissistic relationship, and she has the data to show it. So they will, let's say you go to them and say, hey, like, you got to stop texting this woman at work. Like, this isn't cool. Like, this is not right. It doesn't feel good. I don't text her. And really, like, what are you doing getting into my phone? How do you know who I'm texting? And you know what? Like, what are we even talking about here? Like, you don't even pay a lick of attention to me. It's always your friends and your job. And, I just sit here by myself all the time. Like, who are you? What am I even in? Do you see how that happened?
Yeah.
So now we've gone to a partner saying, like, what you're doing is not cool and it makes me uncomfortable, to you've abandoned them.
Right.
But D.A.R.V.O, again, is that originally that work actually was done on sex offenders. But then we came to find out that it actually applied to anyone with an antagonistic personality. But it's really, this is the deny, attack, reverse victim offender. And it confuses the hell out of the other person, because now you're in a new argument. Right? Because now this woman who is saying, like, I'm not cool with how much, you're texting this person and it seems like a little bit too friendly, has now become, you've abandoned your spouse.
The other thing that was creepy about the narcissistic abuse was minimization, because this is, I guess, where somebody says, oh, you're just complaining about this, or you're always being dramatic. And sure, fine, in some ways that's just kind of crappy. But if it's medical stuff that's being minimized, now you're talking about life and death. Because I was trying to think about why this would be anything more than just annoying and hurtful. But yeah, I mean, if someone's saying you're just being dramatic because you have abdominal pain, you could ignore a tumor or something.
Oh, and it happens more often than you think. People delay preventative care. They delay mental health care. They may delay repairs on a car. I mean, it's all kinds. Like, it's not a big deal. Or they may, and it also may stall their lives. Like, oh, please stop. Your boss isn't a bad person. Like, let it go. And a person stays in a job longer than they should or something. So it's everything. But what it does is it undercuts a person's ability to sort of plug into the reality of their own lives, in the sense of, I guess this isn't that big a deal. And so what happens is, even long after you're out of the relationship, you don't feel like you have the voice to be able to say something matters or something is important. And because you've always been told everything in your life is ridiculous and small and all of that. Yeah.
Tell me about breadcrumbing. There's other forms of abuse, but breadcrumbing is something I hadn't heard of before.
So over time, a narcissistic relationship really becomes a place of neglect, right? So narcissistic people are really good at sort of showing up with, sort of attention and fun from time to time, and then not being there at all. And that sort of that back and forth thing is actually why these relationships are so easy to get stuck in, because there's enough good moments sort of sprinkled in there that you feel like you're in something meaningful or fun or important. And we make all our excuses on the basis of that. But over time, more and more and more neglect. And they're showing up less and less and less. So it's nothing. It's almost like you're with a person who doesn't even notice you're in their presence, which is actually a very kind of unsettling feeling. So people in these relationships will make so much out of the littlest thing. Like they'll say, "Oh, you're not going to believe it." They say, because it turns out we were recording this on Valentine's Day kind of thing. But they'll say things like, "You won't believe this. They said Happy Valentine's Day to me this morning before they went to work." And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're like, "Oh, you're not going to believe it. Like they did remember my birthday. I mean, yeah, they did. They had to go to business trips. Their job's really important, but they did send me a birthday text." And this is their partner. And so you take this little thing, or like, "They came home for dinner. Amazing. Like, we're so good. Like they came home for dinner." And so that sort of taking the tiniest thing and making it into all this good stuff, literally turning a breadcrumb into a meal, because the narcissistic person's learning they can do less and less and less, and you're still on the chain. But it's two parts to this process. The other person, desperate to keep it going for this reason of trauma bonding and all this other stuff, will make something out of that. And here's where it gets tricky, Jordan, because in our world, sort of the relationship industrial complex is like, well, appreciate every little thing they do. So you're reading another blog that's saying, show gratitude 5 times a day. That's almost masochistic, having to show gratitude to someone who's ignoring you.
And then, of course, if you try to end things with them, they'll be love bombing, right? Because the deprivation has lasted so long that they can now turn it up a couple of notches to try and retain you. And it seems like that might be more effective if they've deprived you in the first place.
Well, if they've deprived you, they don't even have to love bomb you. Like I said, they just have to show up for dinner.
Show up for
They
dinner,
don't
right?
have to
Yeah.
cook. That's it. That's all they have to do. But they have to sort of say, "You look pretty." They have to have sent you a birthday text. Like the littlest things become the stuff that is enough and in the relationship. And if they really do sense you slipping away, then they'll start the full court press again, just long enough to get you back in.
What is trauma bonding? You just mentioned that, but I've heard it before, but I don't really know what it is.
Yeah, so I get into it a lot in the book. So trauma bonding is this sort of almost a connection, relationship, tie to someone we feel that almost feels psychologically unbreakable. And it's created by the backing and forthing between good and bad, chaos and consistency. So you're kind of always on your back foot in these relationships. And because these relationships often start from a relatively idealized place, things are great. You feel seen, you feel heard, you feel loved, you feel valued. There's all this fun. That becomes this sort of like bank account you keep trying to draw from your justifications. It will get overdrawn over time, right? But what ends up happening is that that over time, this will feel like you're justifying, you're rationalizing. But over time too, you're blaming yourself more. People say, "This has got to be my fault." If it's your fault, then it can be fixed, right? You could do something different. People in trauma bonded relationships will find that they are constantly having the same conflict with this person. Nothing is ever getting resolved. It can also feel sort of, people, when they describe trauma bonded relationships, it'll be sort of, there's not a lot of there. They'll say like, I don't know. It's like we have a magical connection. I'm like, what is the hell is a magical connection? Like, it doesn't even mean anything. Like, give me something I can hang a hat on. Like, what is this? It's not like, they won't say like, this person is, I trust them. I respect them. We laugh together. It's none of that stuff. Or they'll get stuck again on ephemeral stuff like loyalty. Like, well, people love their parents. And I'm like, well, then why do you love your parent? Like, well, I mean, ejaculation doesn't qualify someone for be a parent. I mean, let's just call that straight. But people are like, well, they're my parent. Like,
Right.
give me more. And so when it's a trauma bonded relationship, right, it's kept in place by this, again, this sort of this pseudo connection that's created by, well, there's a someday better coming, and I know it's going to come, and I know I can do something to make it come. And people in trauma bonded relationships, Jordan, intellectually can even say, I know this isn't healthy. I know it's not, but I don't know how to tell you. Like, if I have to leave this, I'm having a sense of panic even thinking about it. So there's this sort of left brain, right brain, sort of like emotionally laden, I can't leave, but this intellectually present, I understand it's not healthy for me. That's the trauma bonded relationship.
So fascinating. And I think a lot of people listening are like, oh no, I'm doing that. And that's kind of why one of the reasons I love doing these kinds of episodes is because every time, like the last time you and I did an episode, I got so many emails that were people like, this explains so much, whether it's their husband, their mother-in-law, one of their kids. And so I'm looking forward, it sounds weird to say that, but I'm looking forward to those emails because it means that the lights went on and the light bulb went off over someone's head and they go, okay, now that I know what's going on, I can get the book and then figure out what to do about it instead of just blaming myself for my failing marriage and my husband who's cheated on me 78 times with different people.
And nothing I'm doing is changing. Right. I lost weight. That didn't work. I got new boobs. That didn't work. I got my hair fixed. It didn't work. Nothing is going to work.
Keeping a journal of all the times, which is one of your bits of advice, actually, of all the times you've been gaslighted and abused, well, that's gonna break the shelf, the psychological shelf you're using to hold all that crap eventually, right? It's going to be hard to deny when you're on your 13th notebook because it's full of double-sided, printed out, whatever accounts of this person treating you like crap. That's you can't really deny that it exists anymore.
You can't deny it, but you still feel that physiological feeling, which is why healing isn't as simple as saying, this person's terrible, I have to do something about this. It's also understanding how you experience this in your body.
I would love to do another show in a few months because I'm like halfway through my notes on this. We got to talk about at some point how to spot a narcissist, how they suck us back in and retain us, what psychological tricks we're playing on ourselves, like euphoric recall and all these different things, self-blame. I would love to get into that in the next one, but we're going to be here all day if we do it now. So I'm just going to say thank you so much for this, but we got to do something in the spring or the summer too.
I would love to. I love talking with you. Again, you do a deep dive. You read the book so carefully. And so, but above all else, I want to always remind people, as hard as this all sounds, It's Not You is really a book that tells you anyone can heal and you can heal. And what's on the other side is actually really good.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your wisdom and can't wait for the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you for checking out this entire episode on YouTube. If you want to follow up on this topic, check out our podcast feed or visit us on our website at jordanharbinger.com, where you can learn more about our guest and dive even deeper into what we discussed today. And remember, YouTube is not the only place that you can check out The Jordan Harbinger Show. Any podcast app should have us. Check out the links in the description where you will find access to our shows that don't appear on YouTube, like Skeptical Sunday, where we debunk topics like crystal healing, GMOs, conspiracy theories, homeopathy, tipping, even lawns, to find out if they're backed by science and logic, or if they're just complete nonsense. Spoiler, many of them are complete nonsense. Also, our Feedback Friday shows where we help people escape from cults, get raises at work, and take all manner of questions from you, the audience, all the way down to the bottom of the barrel. And every episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show has something useful you can take away and apply in your own life and help you navigate what I know can often seem like the overwhelming and paralyzing challenges of modern life. Life can be hard, yes, but we are here to help. And if you appreciate how we help, remember to like, comment, and subscribe.